Hello, students of history and political science. I'm Mr. Tesch, and welcome to Global Chat, where we explore the ins and outs of the field of study known as comparative politics. This is my very first presentation of the school year for my critical thinking and AP comparative government and politics students, and in it, I'm going to introduce you to our very first class project. As you know, our course is a combination of two courses, critical thinking and comparative government and politics. So you can understand critical thinking as a course on how to do research and how to learn about the world around you independently, while comparative government and politics is a political science class where we learn about countries all over the world and their political systems. Now normally, you might take these two courses in two separate semesters, but because there's so much overlap between the two courses, we kind of combine the two and make them one big year-long class. The first challenge that we're going to tackle this school year is how to write a research paper. And the best way to learn how to do that is to try it for ourselves. We're going to go through the process of independent research and are then going to write a paper of our own. I'll show you how to find sources of information and how to analyze those sources to draw your own conclusions from them. We're going to be working in the Media Center and our classroom, although we'll probably find most of the information that we need for this project on the internet. You'll probably also have to spend some time at home doing some more research or completing parts of the project that you don't complete in class. As we work on this project, here are some of the goals of this unit. Writing a research paper is a pretty complex process, and you'll develop quite a few different skills. First of all, you'll learn how to ask questions, but also how to refine those questions and how to answer them. An important part of answering these questions is learning how to find information in a library or on the internet, and how to make sure that information is trustworthy and produced by experts in their fields. But doing a research project also means you'll find lots of information that isn't helpful in answering your research question. I know that when I'm doing research to prepare for class or to do some writing, I sometimes have to go through several articles or even books before I find one bit of information that I need to draw some conclusions. Once you've learned to find, evaluate, and analyze your sources of information, then it's time to present your findings in the form of a paper. To do that, you're going to learn how to bring together lots of information to not only show your readers what you found, but to also convince them of something. We're going to learn how to cite our sources, which means telling our readers where we found our information. In our class, we use a citation format known as MLA style. Now this style is going to be really useful to you, not only in this class, but also in your English classes, throughout high school, and even into college. Throughout this project, I want to keep this question in mind. How can research skills help us learn about the world around us? Of course, the skills we learn here are going to be a cornerstone of this class for the rest of the year. But I want you to think beyond this class and beyond this school year. Think about where in life or in different lines of work, having some skills in doing research can be an important thing. Towards the end of the unit, we're going to circle back to this question and discuss it. All right, I know what you're thinking. Let's get to the project. So here it is. Our first step is going to be picking a research topic. Now, a lot of times when you do research, you're going to get to pick your own topic. For this project, though, because this is our first one, I've picked a topic for us. Once we have our topic, it's time for step 2, where we have to kind of look at what we already know about that subject and go find out some basics about it. You can't really research something until you're kind of familiar with it, and then it's time for steps 3 and 4. This is where we're going to go and start looking for our sources of information. For these steps, you're going to turn in what's called an annotated work cited, which is basically a list of sources you found and are going to use in your research paper. That's going to be your first assignment of this project. Now, a lot of students are surprised, but this is usually the longest part of the research process. You'll have to read probably dozens of articles, look through books, encyclopedias, and all kinds of sources of information before you can start forming your opinions and thoughts on the topic. And this just takes some time. But if you do it well, you'll find that writing the paper is not difficult or intimidating, and it won't take you nearly as long as you think. Once you've got as much information as you can find, it's time to start organizing your thoughts and outlining your research paper. For our class, you're going to turn in an outline so that I can take a quick look at it and give you some feedback before you write your final paper to present your findings. Of course, the biggest part of the project is the research paper you turn in at the end. Because this project is so substantial and really a big part of what you're supposed to be learning in this class, it ends up being a really big part of your final grade too. So let's really give it our best and let's see what we can learn. Let's start by taking a look at our research topic. Our topic is that of gender equality around the world. At the heart of this topic is the idea that it is a fundamental right that men and women are equal, and that they should be afforded the same political and social rights anywhere and anytime. Then we're going to investigate 6 countries around the world, and we'll see just how differently men and women are treated in the different countries. So that you can get some background knowledge on the subject of our research, I'm going to show you some sources that you can start with before you start to dig in and do your own research. All right, here it is. Here's our prompt. Develop an argument as to which policies pursued by the countries in our course are most effective at promoting the protection of political and social rights of women, as laid out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In other words, we're going to write about how the laws and policies adopted by one of the 6 countries that we're studying, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, Mexico, Iran, and Nigeria, and how those countries have tried to promote more gender equality. To do this, we're going to have to do a little research. First of all, the prompt asks us about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What is that? And what kinds of things have these countries done to try and promote gender equality? Then, we have to find out, how do we know if these policies were effective in achieving some level of gender equality? Well, here's something really great to look at right from the start. This is called the Gender Inequality Index, and it's put out by an organization called the United Nations. Now, we're going to be learning a lot about the United Nations. It's basically an institution where almost all countries in the world come together to discuss problems and how they can work together to try and solve them. Every year, the United Nations puts out this report where they look at the people of the world and their quality of life. They study things like life expectancy, poverty, the environment in the places that they live, and what governments can do to improve those situations. Then they rank countries across a bunch of different categories, one of them being gender inequality. What this index does is measure gaps in terms of the well-being, education, and standard of living between men and women. Of the countries that we learn about, gender inequality is the lowest in the United Kingdom, which ranks 15th in the world. Toward the bottom is Nigeria, where gender inequality is really high. Nigeria ranks 152nd in the world, and that's out of 193 countries. What this tells us is that countries have varying degrees of gender inequality. It tells us that in the United Kingdom, men and women can expect to have a comparable life expectancy or access to healthcare as men, but not in Nigeria. It tells us that women and men can enjoy about the same amount of education in the United Kingdom, but not as much in Iran. It tells us that women and men in the United Kingdom can expect to have similar living standards or incomes, but not in some of the other lower-ranked countries. But what we don't see in just these numbers is why these countries are ranked the way that they are. To do that, we have to peel back the surface by doing a little research. If we do that well, we find that women don't have the same access to education in Iran and Nigeria, and experience inequality in pay or workplace opportunities in the United Kingdom and Mexico. In some countries, such as Russia and Mexico, problems like increasing rates of domestic violence against women continue to be an issue. There are many, many more kinds of problems in societies all over the world, and governments can try to create policy and laws to try and help address them. Let's talk about a little history, because at this point, you may be wondering, well, why does this topic matter to me? We live in the United States, a very wealthy and highly developed democratic society that ranks just above the United Kingdom on the Gender Inequality Index. So we're doing pretty well, right? Well, first of all, just because the United States has less gender inequality than the other countries doesn't mean that there isn't room for improvement. 12 countries still rank higher than the United States, and there are good reasons for that. But more importantly, the only way that the world has been able to achieve more political and social equality over the course of the last 2 centuries is because people became aware of inequality and injustice and worked hard to try and right those wrongs. In the early 1800s, only a handful of men in countries like Britain and the United States had any right to vote at all, for example. And there was no country where a woman would have had the right to vote. Today, 80 of the world's 193 countries have what we might call universal suffrage. That's a big improvement, but there's obviously still a long way to go. It's also true that in 1900, not a single country in the world had a system of government that we would call a democracy. Today, that number is close to 120. But even among these 120 democracies, only 25 have a woman serving as a head of state or head of government. And don't forget that the United States has never had a woman serve as president or vice president, and that less than 25% of lawmakers in our Congress are women. So we see that there's been lots of improvement, but it's only if we educate ourselves on these issues and spread awareness that we can really be a part of affecting positive change. Part of the prompt asked us to talk about the rights guaranteed to men and women in the Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations in 1948. This is the same United Nations, by the way, that creates the Gender Inequality Index that I just showed you. The Declaration of Human Rights was drafted by representatives with different legal and cultural backgrounds from all over the world by a committee called the Human Rights Commission. Students are always really surprised to learn that it was Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who chaired the drafting committee of the Declaration. So on December 10, 1948, the United Nations General Assembly, which was meeting in Paris at the time, proclaimed the Declaration as a common standard of achievements for all peoples and nations. At the time, it was passed as Resolution 217A and was signed by 48 of the United Nations' 58 member states at the time. I really recommend that this document be kind of your first stop as you start your research on gender equality. As you read it over, think about the goals that it sets and think about whether or not our society regularly meets those goals or whether there's room for progress. Also, remember that this declaration is about all human rights of all people and that it has many, many more aspirational goals than just guaranteeing men and women political and social equality. So now that we've thought a little bit about the history of gender inequality and we kind of have an idea of where the world stands, we're still left with one big question. How do we know what countries are doing to promote gender equality, and how do we know if these policies are working? This is where our research begins. Here are 4 sources that you can start with right away. You'll have access to all of them within the assignment instructions. The first one is a map that shows you what percentage of lawmakers are women in every country in the world. This will be very useful if you want to talk about why some countries seem to do more to try and reduce gender inequality than others. It makes sense that a country with more women in government might be more proactive about trying to implement policies that promote gender equality, for example. The second source is a database of countries and tells you if and how that country is trying to make sure more women have an opportunity to be elected to serve in government. The database is maintained by the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, which is an organization that works to educate people all over the world to promote democracy and democratization. It's a really cool source for this project in general because you can look into how IDEA is promoting getting more women elected to public office. The third source is really cool if you want to find out more information about each of our 6 countries and how they're promoting human rights in general, which also includes gender equality. So the United States Department of State publishes a human rights report on almost every country on Earth, and it updates them constantly. Now, I have to warn you, the reports are pretty long, but the key is that you don't have to read the whole thing, nor would you want to if you're doing a project like this one. Simply look at the table of contents and look for the sections of the article that are pertinent to our topic. For example, I looked at the Iran article, and for this project, I would be interested in reading Section 6 on discrimination against women, and maybe Section 3 on the right to participate in government. Finally, the fourth source listed here is the OECD, or Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's another international organization with 37 member states. Part of what the OECD does is study and publish economic data and information about each of its member countries. And it has some information about the pay gap between men and women in each of its member states. So the pay gap is the average difference between the earnings of men and women doing the same job. There is no country on Earth where average earnings are higher for women than men, but there are countries with a much smaller pay gap than others. If you're interested in how large this pay gap is in different countries, or what different governments are trying to do about the pay gap, you can look here for more publications. As you're looking through all of the sources that you find, remember to think about whether or not the policies that governments are putting in place are working to reduce gender inequality or not. For example, in February 2014, Mexico's Congress passed a constitutional amendment requiring that political parties develop rules to ensure gender equality in the nomination of candidates in federal and local congressional elections. This means that political parties were now required by law to alternate between women and men on parties' candidate lists. As you can see in the charts, Mexico's legislature is now divided almost entirely equally between men and women. There is some hope that over time this policy will bring about changes that produce gender equality across Mexican society. For now, the law has been effective in helping women get elected to Congress. Another example is this data from the OECD on the wage gap that I mentioned earlier. What stands out to me is that both the United Kingdom and Mexico have a pretty significant wage gap, which means that women probably earn significantly less than men. The next step here is to look at what these countries have done to try and reduce this wage gap. The United Kingdom passed the Equal Pay Act 50 years ago, which made it illegal to pay women less than men for doing the same work. And while this has led to a decrease in the pay gap, there is still a significant difference in the average earnings of men and women. Now, if I'm doing research, I might look at what the British government has done since the Equal Pay Act to try and further reduce this inequality. At this point, it's time to start putting together our annotated works cited. This is kind of a list of the sources that you want to use, and that will be a part of your research project. Before you get started, we also need to talk about how to make sure the sources that we find are credible or trustworthy, and how to format a document like this using a word processing software. An annotated works cited is a list of the sources that you find as you research a topic that also includes summaries of those sources. Once I send you to the library and the internet to find information on a research topic like this one, your job is to find as many sources as you can to help you answer that topic, and to turn in a list of those sources with summaries of each one. Now, I'm going to take a look at your sources and give you some feedback or other ideas to help guide you before you start working on your research papers. Two things are really important as you create your annotated works cited. The first is that you need to know how to cite sources using something called MLA style. We're going to talk about that in more detail a little bit later. The other thing is that you include a summary of each source that you find. In this summary, you should make note of why that source is credible and also how you're going to use the information in that source to answer the prompt. Your summaries should be pretty specific, and each one will end up being about a paragraph long. Now, a question that I get all the time from students is, well, how many sources do I need? That's a tricky question because the answer depends on the scope of your project. Now, if you're a doctoral student writing a doctoral dissertation to earn a PhD, you might need literally hundreds of sources. But for the scope of this little practice research paper, I would suggest that you have between 6 and 8 sources to get you started. In class, we did an activity where we sorted out sources that were credible from ones that were not credible. A simple trick when you come around a source is to do what's called a crap test. Just ask yourself a few questions about that source, and you'll have a better idea about whether or not it's credible. Is the information current, or is it too old for our topic? Is the information relevant to our topic, or is it about something different? Is the author someone who knows this subject well? Did you find data that contradicts your source or raises questions about your source's accuracy? And does the author have a motive to mislead the reader? I want to take a moment and talk about that last question, which is particularly important, but also kind of tricky. I think it's easiest to explain with an example. In the 1950s, the tobacco industry claimed that smoking doesn't cause lung cancer. They even had spokespeople make statements to Congress that cigarettes that they produced did not cause lung cancer. Well, it turns out these folks knew very well that they were lying. So the question is, why would the tobacco industry lie about cigarettes causing cancer? It's simple. They had a motive. Tobacco was and is a very profitable business, and having the government regulate the sale of their products would have lost them money. So when you look at a source, be careful to think about who published it and whether they have a reason to be more or less truthful. What other sources can you use, and what can you trust to be credible? On the left, I've listed some of the international and state organizations that I've already mentioned. In addition to those, you can, of course, use other government publications as well. Recently, I was doing research on the United Kingdom leaving the European Union in what is known as Brexit, and read lots of great analysis put out by the British Parliament on their website. These kinds of sources are also great. But for the scope of this class and this project, I think it's also okay for you to use the work of journalists. Magazines and newspapers such as The Economist, The New York Times, Vox, The Guardian, and others do a great job of kind of analyzing and digesting lots of information and presenting it in an easy-to-read way. For you guys as young high schoolers, I think you can absolutely use these kinds of sources, as long as you're careful to think about whether or not they're credible or biased, like we learned. Try and stick to newspapers and magazines by publishers with really good reputations that are widely respected, and you're usually going to be fine. Just be careful, many newspapers have an opinion section. Of course, reading opinions of others can be very informative. You just want to be aware that what you're reading is someone's personal view of something and not always based entirely on fact. Alright, so you have 6 to 8 good sources. You've read them carefully, you've evaluated them, and you've thought about how they help you answer your research question. Now it's time to put them in your annotated works cited. I've created a sample works cited here to show you what one of those will look like when formatted in MLA style. Right off the bat, you'll notice that all of the margins on the document are set to 1 inch, and that all of the text is double-spaced. At the top of your paper and on the left-hand side, you should put your name, the date, the class you're writing this for, and the name of your teacher, followed by a title which you center on the page. Then, things get really fun. This is where you start to cite your sources, with a summary of each source underneath each citation. Let me show you how to format those citations. On this slide, I show you how to cite physical books in MLA style. There are other citation styles out there. You might use APA citation in some of your science classes, or a Chicago style in your upper-level history classes. But for our class, we're required to learn MLA style. To cite a book in a works cited, simply write the author's name, followed by a comma, his or her first name, and then a period. This is followed by a title and a period, then the place of publication, the publisher, and finally the publication date. On this slide, I have 2 example citations of William Polk's book Understanding Iran and Ernst Gombrich's book A Little History of the World. Notice that they are in alphabetical order by the author's last name. This is on purpose. Works cited entries are always listed in alphabetical order. Another type of source that you're probably going to be using is online news articles. This is similar to citing a book, but there are a few extra things to look at. First, you have the author's last and first name, followed by the title of the article in quotation marks. That's followed by the title of the publisher in italics, the publication date, the web URL, and finally the date you accessed the article. The reason that we include the access date is that, unlike books, things online can be changed anytime or even taken down. So you want to tell your reader when you got your information in case it is changed, updated, or taken down. Pay really close attention to where the periods and commas go here. That's really important in MLA style and is a little more tricky with journal articles than with books. The reason I show you how to cite articles is that it's really similar to how you would cite any website. If you're trying to cite a website, though, you would just put the title of the web page instead of the article and the title of the website instead of the newspaper. But of course, you can cite all kinds of things. You can even cite YouTube videos to podcasts and magazines. And showing you how to cite every single one of those would be really time-consuming. Besides, nobody memorizes how to cite every kind of source in every citation style. People who write professionally or who write for college courses, they refer to manuals or citation guides to quickly look up how to cite something. I'd like to show you this website from the Purdue University's online writing lab, where there are tons of great resources on how to cite different sources in any style that you want. The link is available to you in the assignment instructions and on our course page. And if you have a question about how to cite something anytime this year, I'm always going to point you here first, because it's very likely that I would have to look it up myself, so that I don't accidentally give you a wrong answer. That leaves one last question. Once you've cited your source, how should you annotate it? By annotation, what I mean is a summary. So an annotated works cited includes a summary of each of your sources. Each of your annotations should summarize the source. If you're not sure what to write, think about what are the main arguments? What is the main point of the book or article? What topics are covered? If someone asked what this article or book is about, well, what would you say? Once you've summarized a source, ask yourself, how does it fit into your research? Was the source helpful to you? How does it help you shape your argument? How can you use this source in your research project? Has it changed how you think about this topic? You can tell your reader any of this in your summaries, and it's also a really great way to remember why you wanted to use a source later on when it's time to write your research paper. I remember when I had to write my master's thesis, and I had 50 or 60 different sources. By the time I had actually started writing my final paper, I had forgotten some of the sources I had looked at, and I was actually really glad I had taken some notes or annotations to refer back to so that I could find that information again. So take your time and write your annotated works cited well, and you'll have a much easier time with the rest of this project. Then it's time to get to work on outlining our actual paper. For our class, you're going to turn in an outline. Let's talk about what an outline is, how to outline the introduction and body of your essay, and then some of the different choices you have when creating your outline. The point of an outline is to help us organize our thoughts before we start writing. As you do your research, you'll have come across tons of information, and organizing all of that into a paper that is informative and persuasive and easy to read requires some planning. In terms of formatting, I'm really flexible here in what I hope to see from you. There's not really a correct way to format one of these. There are, however, outlines that are very good and serve their purpose, and outlines that are less good. To make sure you've got a good outline, remember that you want your outline to help you do three things. You want a way to brainstorm your ideas, organize them using labels as you write your paper. At this point, you'll want to think about what you want each section of your paper to do. The introduction of your research paper is going to do three things. First, you want to grab your reader's attention right off the bat. Maybe you want to provide them with a shocking fact or statistic. Tell them why this topic is important, or connect with your reader by telling them how this topic will affect them in their own lives. There's no right or wrong way to start a research paper, but you want to grab their attention somehow. This is followed by the thesis, which is really the most important part of your research paper. Your thesis is your response to the prompt, or your answer to the research question. Your thesis is what the rest of your paper is going to be all about. It's what you're going to be proving to be true for however many pages long your paper is going to be. Now, a good thesis will be specific and something that you can prove. It might sound something like, the most effective policies adopted by countries to reduce gender inequality are those that increase the representation of women in government and those that reduce discrimination in the workplace. Last, you want to kind of give your reader a bit of a roadmap, which is like an overview of what the rest of your paper is going to be about. If you're going to write about gender quotas and the wage gap and how governments try to address those, then this is where you would want to tell your reader to expect that as they continue reading. So before we move on to the body of your paper, I should mention that this is one good way to write an introduction, but it's not the only way. I always encourage students to try this way, especially if they've never written an academic paper before. In your English classes and as you move on through high school, you're going to learn some other approaches and styles to writing expository and argumentative essays. But I find that this formula is generally a really effective and simple way to get started. Just like writing an introduction, there are many ways to organize and write your body paragraphs. The approach here is useful for the kind of paper that we're writing, because it calls for us to support our thesis, provide evidence, and explain our reasoning. You're going to have several supporting claims to support your thesis, and each body paragraph should be organized around one supporting claim. To show that your claim is based on evidence, you're going to need a quote, paraphrase, summarize, and cite whatever evidence you've found. Finally, each body paragraph might close with an impact statement that explains your reasoning and how the evidence that you used supports your claim and your thesis. This is also a chance for you to write about why what you found out here is so important. At this point, I should mention that when you're writing your outlines, you shouldn't write too much. This is not your research paper, it's just an outline. I always encourage students to write phrases, use bullet lists, and abbreviate. Think of this more as a rough sketch or a plan of your research paper that you're going to be putting into writing later. Here's a good example of something called an alphanumeric outline. In a program like Word or Google Docs, it's very easy to do. Simply create a numbered list. I always like using Roman numerals for these kinds of outlines, but again, it's very personal and totally up to you. There's a sample of this in the assignment instructions in our course. Instead of creating an alphanumeric outline, you can also always create some kind of diagram. You can do these digitally or on paper. I've even seen students use poster paper and put sticky notes with their ideas on it to organize their thoughts. What I like about this kind of diagram is that it kind of lets you visualize your whole paper at a glance, and it kind of shows you how each body paragraph is supposed to support the thesis. These are just some ideas. You can find other suggestions on websites like the Purdue Online Writing Lab if you prefer to try a different approach. Just remember that your outline needs to help you brainstorm and then organize your thoughts, and that you need some labels for different sections of your paper. If you stick to that, whatever you decide to do for your outline will be just fine. All right, we're finally ready to write our research paper. Before we start, let me say that the hardest part is behind us. With all of the preparation work of digging through information, creating an annotated works cited, and planning our essay with a draft, I think you'll find that actually writing the paper may just be the easiest part. Before we get down to it, let's just quickly talk about what a research paper is, what components you need to have, and how to cite sources while you're writing. The goal of a research paper is to bring together different views, evidence, and facts about a topic from books, articles, and interviews, then to interpret the information into your own writing. When I was a student, I kind of liked writing research papers because I liked that I could learn about the world for myself and I could focus on what interested me. Now, a paper like this one, written in MLA style, has just a few components that we need to pay attention to. First of all, your paper will be formatted almost exactly like the annotated works cited, with your name, date, class, and teacher name at the top, and followed by a title. Also, the margins should again be set to 1 inch all around, and all text should be double-spaced and in 12-point Times New Roman font. The last page of your research paper is the works cited page, where you list all of your sources in MLA style. Do notice that you don't need to include your annotations in this works cited. So if you'd like to copy your sources over to this document, you can, but make sure you delete the annotations here. When you need to refer to a source in the body of your paper, please remember to cite your source. That way, your reader can follow up on where you found your information by looking at the works cited page. There are a few different ways to do this. You can refer to the author within the sentence and paraphrase or summarize what they say, or you can paraphrase or summarize the source and then include the author's last name in parentheses followed by a comma and the page number. Of course, you can always just quote the author directly and then cite your source, as in the third example here. If you're not sure how to cite a source, I would refer you back to the Purdue Online Writing Lab and look at the page on MLA in-text citations, where it'll show you the different ways that you can cite your sources. Finally, let's briefly talk about your writing style for this paper. When you write a research paper, you're defending a thesis or a position that you've taken based on evidence that you found. To do that effectively, you want to write with a tone that says, "I know what I am talking about." To do that effectively, there are some words that you can avoid. Avoid contractions such as don't, can't, or won't. Instead, write out the full words. It just sounds better. Avoid run-on expressions like "and so on," etc. All they do is tell your reader you don't really know what to say. Avoid using cliches like "it's no big secret, we all know, sleep like a baby." You just don't need them in an academic paper. Also, words like thing and stuff make you sound vague. Be more specific. Finally, avoid words like good, bad, and better. Let me give you an example. I've seen a lot of students write things like the United Kingdom has a much better economy than Mexico. Now, as a reader, that doesn't really tell me anything, except that the student likes the British economy better. But what does better mean? Instead, they should have told me, the United Kingdom has a more diverse and productive economy, or the United Kingdom is wealthier overall. This is more specific and more appropriate for this kind of paper. So there you have it, our first big research project of the year. I hope this presentation is helpful as you navigate the process of writing your first research paper. Remember that I'm here for you every step of the way to help you through the process, and that you can always ask me questions or get my help or input. Good luck, and I look forward to reading what you come up with.